Serious. People who have happened upon dead corpses randomly, what happened? As a teenager, I went on a walk through the green belt behind my house. The woods had a peculiar smell, but I was used to stumbling across dead animals on rare occasions, so I didn't think anything of it. Clambered over a log and looked down to find I'd stepped in her hair. She'd been left on the hidden side of the log wrapped in a tarp and was well into the process of decomposition. No lips, eyes, etc. Went home and called my mom in a fog of shock, and she called the police. They didn't really believe me and were super casual while they walked me out to the spot so I could show them where she was. Their demeanors changed the instant they saw her, and from there it was all a whirlwind. She was my age, murdered and dumped after intercourse by one of my high school teachers. I testified as a witness to finding her, never really understood why they needed that. He went to prison, but I think he might be out by now. I feel terrible for her family. It didn't traumatize me, but it gave me a lot to think about in regards to the value and shortness of life. I started saying I love you to my family members a lot more afterward. It was a summer in between ending high school and starting college. Went to a local beach with a few friends and their girlfriends. It was overcast that day, so there really wasn't anyone else there. The water was pretty rough, and we were body surfing for most of the day. As we're surfing the waves, we see Coast Guard officers roaming around by the edge of the water. Soon enough, Coast Guard vehicles start driving on the beach near the water. We knew something was up. They told us we need to leave this stretch of beach immediately and don't be within 3/4-mile radius of the area. Still a very odd request to me. Sure enough, as we begin walking back to the parking lot, we see something floating in the water. I thought it was an animal until one of my friends turned white at the sight of a water-bloated man lying face down. Found out a few days later it was someone who drowned while parasailing. Absolutely tragic. Found a dead guy at the train station by where I used to live. Not sure what happened, but I thought he was just a drunk waiting for the train. He was sort of sitting with his head down. I tapped him in a lame attempt to wake him up and got nothing. I shook him a little harder and he just sort of slumped to the side, and when his head went back, his face was gray and his eyes were open but empty. Called the cops who came and gave my statement. Another time was walking to lunch with a friend in New York City. A guy had jumped out of a window. Older buildings have windows that open, even 20 or 30 stories up. He nosedived, bounced hard off a cab, and was flopped in the street while the cops put the sheet down. Blood everywhere. Meanwhile, the passers-by stood there with their phones out taking pictures. I will never understand people wanting to take pictures of stuff that gruesome. Like, I would be trying everything to erase that from my mind, not frigging etch it into my memory with a photograph. In my junior year of college, my best friend and I were skipping school and walking around the woods of Murphy Park in Park Forest/Chicago Heights. There was an older man sitting on a bench on the trail, briefcase, suit, etc. He reached into the briefcase when he saw us, pulled out a revolver, shoved it in his mouth, and ended himself. My friend and I sat there and freaked before we ran to his house over on Dogwood and called the cops. I don't know the story, all I know is I have never forgotten that smell since then. Also, we didn't end up getting into trouble for skipping, so we had that going for us, which was nice. Back in 2010, I was on the train coming home from classes. When approaching the station, there was a loud bang and people started flooding off the train screaming and crying. I knew something bad had happened, but I didn't know what. The platform was sheer chaos, and I cautiously walked up the platform to figure out what to do. That's when I saw him. A 6 to 7-year-old boy had been running with his grandfather to catch his train and let go of his grandfather's hand. He tripped and went between the train and platform, killing him instantly. All I could see were his legs, and his grandfather slumped over next to the body. I immediately went into shock and had to get on a bus to get back home. I remember seeing one of my classmates on the bus, and I must have been in some state as I vaguely recall the whole bus just looking at me as I told her what had happened. Really messed me up for a long time. I have been kayaking and found a man whose decomposition was at the burst stage. Another time I was part of the recovery of a scuba diver who had been lost inside USS San Diego for about a month at approximately 120 FSW. His mask came off and eyeballs fell out as he was pushed through to me. I've come across multiple corpses, mainly living in Seattle. Most of the time they were overdoses. The usual giveaway that they were dead, especially in the winter, would be to notice missing shoes. Not making a joke, it's just other homeless people would take their shoes if they were decent. The first time, it was a bit jarring to see. The second, third, 14th time, etc., not as much. My mom found a dead body on the hiking trail near our house in California, still being guarded by the family dog. She couldn't even get close. It happened to be a classmate's father who had a heart attack. I also saw a guy step in front of a car on purpose one night and held his hand as he died. By that time, I was very used to seeing dead bodies, and it didn't really faze me. I can't even imagine getting to a point where it doesn't faze me, and I do not want to get to that point. In my mid-20s, walking to work, I saw 3 homeless men sitting against a brick wall drinking by some railroad tracks behind a Target. One of the men looked a little off, but I couldn't tell why till I got a little closer. He had some blood leaking from his ears, nose, eyes, mouth. Not thick blood, but watery. I told the 2 men their friend looked like he needed help, and they just stared off into the distance. When I crossed the street and got to work, I told my coworkers what I saw. About 20 minutes later, a coworker called me over to a window to point out a coroner's van loading a body across the street. After work, I walked back to where I found the 3 men earlier and counted 15 empty vanilla extract bottles. I have the impression he drank them all. One morning last November, I woke up and walked into my great-grandmother's room to tell her good morning like I'd always done many times before. She didn't respond, which was normal since dementia had kicked in and we have been having hospice over. It wasn't until a few minutes later that my grandma told me that she had died sometime in the middle of the night. I didn't even realize she was gone, so yeah. My class was making teepees in grade 5 and me and a friend found a guy hanging from a tree. We told our teacher and didn't hear anything after that. On a drive to work early one morning, I came down a hill to see a vehicle off in a field to my right. It was upside down and on fire, so I immediately stopped and called 911. As I was running up to the vehicle, I could see the driver still strapped in. He wasn't moving or screaming, so I could only assume he was already dead. I couldn't get to him because of the fire. I really struggled with that for a while. Thanksgiving, when I was 11 years old. I was walking around the edge of a golf course with my father and a friend when I saw some legs sticking out from a large bush/small tree. As I got closer, I could see there was a shotgun sitting between his legs, leaning up against the trunk. My father thought it was a prank. I pulled the branches back and witnessed something that I'll never forget. The sight of what was left of the face. The picture of what I presumed to be his family in his lap. I wanted to simultaneously vomit, scream, and run away. I did the latter. Didn't eat for a few days. Drug raid happened near our house. I live in the Philippines. While biking down the road down the house, I find an arm sticking out of one of the nearby bushes. Thought it was a mannequin arm or something, since one of our neighbors is a seamstress. I ride over it thinking nothing of it when all of a sudden, crunch. I found out it was one of the druggies who got away but ended up dying of blood loss from being shot. Still had a knife in his hand. Safe to say I don't go on that route when biking to my friend's house. Boy, the way that I imagine that would stick with you, like riding over what turns out to be a human arm and hearing a crunch, that would really mess with me. I was the first person to see my coworker after he hanged himself in our weld shop by lifting his body on the overhead crane. His neck looked like it stretched a couple of feet and his face was dark purple. We didn't feel too bad for him after finding out that he was about to be charged with R-ing his 13-year-old stepdaughter and wanted an easy way out. I was coming back from my grandparents' house and saw a dead body hanging from a tree. I was 13. Strange coincidence that this all culminated on Halloween 2017. A friend of mine living in East London noticed that a man from the flat overlooking her balcony was looking straight at her late at night. She brushed it off and finished her cigarette and went to bed. The next evening, when she was out there again, she noticed the man still staring at her in the same spot. She told her housemate, and they decided he was just some weirdo who liked looking out of his window. You get a lot of strange folk in London. On the third day, the man was still there, but his color had changed and his lower jaw had dropped open. That's when they decided to call the police. The police entered the apartment block and broke into the flat. Turns out the man had rented the flat recently and had hung himself by the window by crouching with a thin rope around his neck. The police commented to them how strange it was that he didn't leave a note behind and that he had done his laundry/neatly folded it up before killing himself. When my husband was around 11, he was chilling at the beach with his friends in Florida. They were all playing and had noticed a log out at sea but figured it was just that. A couple of hours go by and I guess curiosity got the better of them and they swam out to check it out. When they were about 10 feet away, past the buoy line, he said it looked abnormally smooth and shiny for a log. They approached it, and there was no doubt that it was a small body, a 4-year-old child. They were in too much shock to even start screaming. My husband says everyone was eerily quiet as they start dragging him out. As they approached the shoreline, they started yelling if anyone knew CPR, and once they brought him on shore, a guy in his 30s runs out and starts performing CPR. Once he started doing chest compressions, the little boy's stomach started inflating too, my husband says, from the pressure probably. The police were called and everything. The auntie who was supposed to be with the boy was charged with manslaughter and neglect. It traumatized my husband to such an extent that he didn't mention it for years until he met me. I was driving down a side street and approaching a stop sign. As I was slowing to a stop, I saw a car stopped at the stop sign approaching me with some kind of frantic action inside. Suddenly, a man opens the passenger door and runs toward the house on the corner. I continued across the intersection, and as I passed the car, I noticed the driver seemed unconscious, so I stopped, as did many other cars. The driver was an elderly woman and apparently had a heart attack or something. She was pulled from the car and a man gave CPR as we waited for the ambulance to arrive, but it didn't matter. The lady was dead. The strange part of this is that the elderly woman was actually taking her driving test for the DMV. The man who ran from the passenger side was the DMV official who was out on the driving test with her. So this lady died while taking her driving test. The DMV official was not in good shape at the scene. I walked out of a building in downtown Phoenix one day and saw a person who had just jumped/fallen from the top. I assume it was the top, I didn't see it happen, of a parking structure next to the Wells Fargo building. The police had just gotten there, or was it the EMTs? This was 5 to 6 years ago, so it's hard to remember, but the scene was new. The poor person was definitely deceased. I didn't know what to do, so I stood there for a minute or two. It was pretty shocking. The responders blocked off the area with tape. I left. When I was maybe 8 or 9, I went to visit my grandpa in the nursing home. I went to go get a snack from the vending machine and wandered around a little bit. I guess I got turned around and ended up walking into a random room thinking it was my grandpa's. There was a man lying in bed, eyes wide open and mouth agape. Being the weirdly cheerful kid I was, I loudly said, "Hi, mister, do you know where my Buppa's," Grandpa's nickname, room is? No answer, but a nurse heard me from the hall. She recognized me from earlier and knew which room I was looking for. She apologized to the guy, but sounded worried when he did not respond. When I got back to my parents, we were getting ready to leave, and we saw some people wheeling a body bag out of the same guy's room. Last Friday, I was on the train in the morning and noticed a homeless guy wrapped up in a sleeping bag laying under one of the benches at one of the stations. Going home, went through the same station and noticed the guy was wrapped up in the same exact place and hadn't moved. It was also in the 90s by that time in the day, so there was no way someone would be bundled up like that. I called the local PD to check as I was on the train, and it's not a station I have to get out at. Pretty sure I reported a body. When I was living in San Francisco, there's a homeless person sprawled on the ground. I asked some passerby if we should call an ambulance, and the guy at the store we were near said the homeless person did this all the time to get tips. I got what I needed from down the street, and on my way back, I saw him being zipped up in a body bag by some paramedics. Kinda figured starting this, but I am still, honestly, pretty sad at how many of these are homeless people. I mean, I guess I'd be sad no matter who it is, but yeah. Me and my friends, we were like 11. We were walking down a train rail, and we saw someone with his head gone. We walked up to the body and saw that he must have put his neck on the trail and let the train do the work. We weren't afraid, but we were confused about where this poor man's head went. We called the police and they took the body, but to this day I am creeped out by that sight of someone headless just laying there. I witnessed a motorcycle crash, 2 dead. One, nothing really physical. Another was completely ripped in two. The top part of him was caught in the railing of a tunnel all mangled. The other part of him was maybe 10 to 15 yards away from him. I could see his intestines and his legs twitching. When I was younger, my mom told me we were going to see my grandma for the last time. I didn't understand that meant we were going to a funeral. I don't know if this counts, but I was not expecting to see her dead. Hey parents, I know it's tough, but prepare your kids for funerals. That is a talk that needs to happen, not a surprise that needs to happen. Short version, some buddies and I went to a park and decided to climb down the bluffs to the beach. Found a dead dude on the beach. So bloated, really gross. Turns out he had been missing for days after jumping into Lake Michigan to go after his effing hat that blew off. Started college 2 days later. That was a hell of a week. Probably mundane to most, but the only one I've seen was a guy who had presumably been ejected from his vehicle in a crash. It wasn't gruesome, but I remember being disturbed by the way his limbs were folded haphazardly and awkwardly about. We were the first on scene at a car crash on a lonely highway in Arizona, on the way to the Grand Canyon. We were medically trained, WFR, so we drove right in. His chest was expanding and retracting, so we thought he was still breathing. In retrospect, it could have been muscle spasms. Possibly agonal breathing as well. Weird thing is, the car was facing the road perpendicular to the highway. He was on the ground with some dried blood on him, but the only window that was broken was the back window of a truck cab, so the small window behind the head of the driver. It does not seem possible he could be launched out the window behind his back while driving. He could have gotten out of the car and collapsed. When the cops and paramedics showed up, they knew immediately that he was dead. Eventually, we drove on and never heard another thing about it. No resolution. That is the hardest part. How did he die? Well, I suppose it was less than random because we knew my mother's cancer was terminal, but I was the one who found her. We were next-door neighbors, and her friend called me because she couldn't reach my mom all day. I suppose this was around 1 in the afternoon. So I let myself into her house and called out for her, making my way to her bedroom. She looked like she was sleeping, just really stiff when I touched her. It really frightened me. I don't know why. I was walking my dog with my mom day before my 16th birthday. Looked down the side of a house with a huge garden. We used to decide what we would do with it. I saw a hand palm up, but not the expected skin color. Pale, pale white. I said to my mom that it was a hand. She refused to believe me, said it was a dummy. I got upset and asked her to go check. Yeah, it was a dead old man. Long story short, he had tripped on the doorstep and died on a very cold night in December. I just hope he died immediately and wasn't left alone for hours waiting. Worst thing was, his eyes were open. I was a stupid effing 14-year-old who got involved with some older kids. We were breaking into houses, and one we broke into, there was an older lady who I guess had been dead for a little while there. I didn't see it long. The older kids in our group had enough sense to get my brother and I, who was also 14 at the time, out of the house as soon as possible. I'm not sure what became of it, but I remember getting home really late that night and both of us throwing up once the adrenaline wore off. Boy, a lot of these about younger kids finding bodies, and I feel terrible for them. I can't even imagine. On my way to school a few years ago, since the bus ride is almost an hour long, I would usually sit by the windows at the end of the bus and sleep. That morning, I was woken up by a sudden jerk. Looked to the left, and there it was, a fresh accident at the next lane. The body was still all bloodied and mangled up. I went into shock, told my teachers at school what happened, and was sent to the counselor, who then sent me home. Still traumatizes me to this day. As a teenager in 1987, I found a dead prostitute on my first day of work at a McDonald's. She had hung herself on the tall fence surrounding our dumpster/compactor area. I freaked and got my manager. My parents used to work for search and rescue. I helped them with it because I liked the idea of finding someone who had been lost. Well, we had an old German Shepherd that worked both live and cadaver. So here I am holding on to this big old German Shepherd on one of the training days when he just takes off and I had no choice but to follow him. He had smelled a guy who had shot himself in the field opposite of the training area. I have to say, it didn't affect me much until days later, but I reported it immediately to the SAR guys. I was on my ride to work last winter and saw a man laying against the guardrail. There was already a small crowd of people there, so I had no reason to stop. A few hundred yards up the road was a lumber truck, and I didn't think anything of it. Later at work, I read the article about the man getting hit by the tire that came off the truck. Wasn't necessarily randomly happened upon, but when I was about 11, my family took a trip to Washington, D.C. An older man was taking a picture of his presumed grandchildren at the feet of Lincoln at the Lincoln Memorial. He took a step further back than he should have without looking and fell down every marble step. I remember my dad running up to help him, but there was no way he lived through that. Confirmed he died on the news later, in front of his grandchildren. I still cannot think about going back to D.C. 8 years later. Please like and subscribe if you've made it this far. I hope you'll enjoy the rest of the video and have a wonderful day. I worked in a bar coming home at 2 a.m., stopped at a gas station, got back in the car. 5 teenagers in a convertible with the top down passed me going fast. I went around a curve and they had taken it too fast and hit a pole. I pulled over. 2 were in the front seat messed up. The passenger was dead with a broken neck hanging over the back of the seat. The driver was all bloody. 3 girls were thrown out, 1 dead and 1 dying. I tried to help the dying girl. She couldn't breathe. She was scratching the grass with her hands. The other girl was a mess and unconscious. I stayed with the girl who couldn't breathe until paramedics got there. She didn't make it. I smelled alcohol, but the newspaper said no alcohol involved. Pretty sure the driver's family had money. I visited the other girl in the hospital, and she asked if her friend suffered. I told her no, but she did. I took donations for the funeral at the bar and gave it to the family. To help with my trauma, they took me up to the roof of the hospital and let me tour the medical hospital. They were kids and went to school with my sister. The driver lived and didn't get in trouble. It was like a horror movie. It was hard to get over. I was 21. Good on you for trying to help, but, wow, that is a scarring experience. This didn't happen to me, but I was there when it happened to my coworker, so don't know if this will get deleted. We work at a local hospital, and the ER was super busy that night. The waiting room had people sitting everywhere, people standing, etc. So my coworker went to the waiting room to call for a patient. The triage nurse pointed them out since they didn't answer to being called and the overcrowding. Coworker walks up to the patient who appears to be sleeping in the wheelchair and their phone dropped on the floor. She picks up the phone and notices the patient was playing a game. When she tries to rouse them again, she realizes they aren't breathing. Obviously, she yells out for someone to call a code and they wheel the patient back quickly to start CPR. The person literally died in a wheelchair in a busy ER sitting next to people, probably minutes before my coworker came out to get them. Talk about the worst luck ever. Not sure if this counts, but when I was 15, I was going to a friend's house. My city has trains that go across the city. Not sure if relevant, but I got off the subway and walked out of the station to watch a guy on a motorcycle get absolutely flattened by a dump truck. There was bones and guts sticking out of a massive trail of blood from where the guy first hit the ground to where the truck stopped. It was horrible. My manager told me about a boy who went missing in 7th grade. I believe he was in her sister's class. Being South Africa, the parents were terrified that he had been shot or taken, so for 6 weeks posters were put out. The whole community were alerted and everyone was on watch for this kid. And 6 weeks into the investigation, the parents started smelling something bad from their backyard. Thinking it was a deer, they went and checked it out. It was their son right behind their wall. 6 weeks dead and withering under 40-degree heat. They think he had come home, grabbed his stuff and gotten dressed, but had fallen and hit his head hard enough to kill him. Poor kid. I was working for a cop who also had some apartments in a really rough part of Memphis. Basically, he would pay us to go clean out these pretty gross apartments with him when a tenant would just disappear without notice, which happened a lot. Everyone at the apartment complex knew who we were and knew this old dude was a cop, and he always open carried his sidearm while we were working there because of the sketchiness. One day we were working and a little girl, maybe 5 years old, comes up to the three of us and plain as day states, "There's a dead man behind the dumpster." I had been throwing crap in the dumpster all day and not looked behind it. Sure enough, though, the cop I was working for went and checked while we sat with the little girl, and he found a dead guy with a giant knife sticking out of his back. Disclaimer, I never actually saw the dead guy, but my boss did. I did not want to see all that. The on-duty cops showed up and made the scene and everything they like to do, and I don't know what happened to that little girl. I hope she got some counseling because she just seemed so unbothered by the whole thing that it was really strange. I came across what I thought was a homeless man sleeping in our back alley a few years ago. Was walking home from work and saw him, but it's Chicago, so homeless sleep anywhere in the summer and just went inside. A few hours later, I came out to take my dog for a walk and there were rats around the guy just doing rat stuff, and that's when I read hit with the smell and called 911. Turns out it was an OD and the guy still had the needle in his hand. I drove around a dead body that appeared to have been shot and was lying partially in the street. No movement, nothing, just stillness. There were already 2 or 3 people standing over the body. I think it was a man. I continued on my way because I didn't know if it was an active situation or what the hell had happened. The people over the person were definitely on the phone with 911 and clearly in distress over witnessing it or coming across the situation. It was eerie and alarming. Happened at my elementary school party back around 1998. We were having a party at this teacher's house with about 30 other kids and 4 other chaperones. There was a pool in the back that was about 8 feet deep. We were all jumping in and out of the pool and it was dark out. Eventually, the teachers told us all to come inside because it was almost time to go home. As we're all getting out of the pool, there was still someone at the bottom and wasn't moving. One of the chaperones jumped in and grabbed him. He was already dead. The whole school had a memorial for him, and it was all honestly just a horrible time. My best friend John hung himself last year. He invited me over to play PlayStation, and an hour later when I arrived, he was hanging from the coat hook on his closet door. I screamed and his older sister ran in. She helped me get him down, and she tried to do CPR, but it was too late. We called an ambulance, and paramedics took his body. He wrote 5 notes, 1 for each of us in our group of friends, 3 in total. 1 for his older sister, and 1 for his father. I would come to find out from his sister that their father was abusive and manipulative, and right after John got off the phone with me, him and his father got into a heated argument, which I now realize was the final straw for him. We were both barely 13. He seemed so happy, great grades, athletic, got along with everyone, always had a smile on his face, and was always happy to help with anything that you needed. I'm sorry I couldn't go into more detail. It's really hard for me to remember that day, and I'll be honest, I'm kind of tearing up at the moment. Hey folks, as someone who has had something like this in their life, let me just tell you, if you're having these thoughts, reach out to someone, please. I promise there is someone who cares and someone who can help. Was biking home from a barbecue. Guy was crossing the street and got hit by a car. The driver was probably distracted, drove off immediately. Guy got swooped up and hit a traffic light on his way to the other side of the street, about 20 meters. Traffic light still has a dent after half a year. His shoe flew right by my face. He died instantly. Couldn't sleep for a while after that. This just happened on Saturday. I found my roommate dead in his room. He hadn't responded to anyone online on Discord for a few days. I noticed he hadn't drank any of the water or lemonade he recently bought. He was a bit sick, coughing and nausea, but didn't seem too crazy. He started missing a lot of work. I asked him Wednesday if he wanted to go to the doctor. He said he was fine, it was just a headache. Saturday, me and my other roommate were really worried, pounded on his door to see if he was still okay. After nothing for like 5 minutes, we opened the door. He was on the ground as if he passed out from partying, sprawled face down and didn't respond to anything, and we didn't see movement. He had died from a pretty rare brain abscess that developed from his relatively minor sickness. I'll never forget what it looks like to see a body locked in rigor mortis. When I was living in Portland, Oregon, I happened to be walking down the street on Christmas morning and witnessed a man who had hung himself from a street lamp. There was a crowd gathered, and the man had obviously just done it because he was clawing at the rope around his neck and turning purple. Someone climbed up to cut him down with a pocket knife, but it seemed to take forever to saw through the rope. He was basically unconscious at this point, and when he hit the ground, his head split open like a melon. It was horrible. One side was white, and the other side closest to the ground was dark purple. I'm pretty sure he was dead, though I left when the ambulance pulled up and yelled at everyone to back off. Not my story, but my aunt's. She was visiting old family friends. They had 2 sons and a daughter, old teens and young adults. She was having coffee with the mom and the boys, but she'd been really fond of the daughter and wanted to catch up with her too. Ah, yeah, she's upstairs in her room. Her room was in the attic, and when my aunt went up there, she discovered the daughter had hung herself. Her family hadn't even known yet, just thought she'd been studying up there for a few hours. My aunt is kind of wary of going up to people now, as to be expected, of course. One day when I was 15 or so, 1960 or 1961, I was at a friend's house when we heard what sounded like a gunshot. We followed the sound around the corner and found a young woman who had shot herself in the head. She was dressed very well. I remember she had a black leather purse and black leather shoes. There was brain matter all over the ground, and pools of her blood had already reached the gutter. A few moments later, a young guy came running. He kneeled by the body and kept asking why. We never found out the reason why she had shot herself, but I assume it was a love-rejected kind of thing. My uncle's girlfriend was staying at a rented house. They were all staying with some other guy. They were very nice. One of them, who also stayed at the house, was in bed when my uncle's girlfriend came in from a day out. She never checked on him. I don't know if it's because she didn't know he was there or just assumed he was asleep. She came in later to see him in his bed, face as pale as a cloud. They think it was a heart attack. I just think it's terrifying to think someone was dead in the room next to you while you were sitting there for 2 hours or so. When I was 8-ish, I was riding on the back of my dad's motorcycle along the fire roads through the woods. We came up to an old yellow car, something like a 70s Nova or Pinto. There was someone in the driver's seat taking a nap. Dad pulled up close to see if they were okay, and the smell was horrible. Dad rode off as soon as the smell hit because he knew what it was. I didn't even remember the story until a couple years ago, as a friend of mine told me a similar story, and I realized that I was picturing it in my head. His was a hanging in the woods. I asked my dad about it, and it turns out it was a guy he vaguely knew from around town. Dad called the police as soon as we got home. The guy had been missing for a few days when we happened across his car. Walked by a car early in the morning on a quiet road with a man inside. He had a plastic bag wrapped around his head with duct tape sealing the neck. Face was purple and eyes were open, looked frozen in place. Luckily, the cops were pulling up as I walked by, but it creeped me out big time. I looked for ID and called the cops. It looked really fresh with an obliterated head with brains everywhere, and I heard steps coming toward me. I ran like the wind, hearing what amounted to a small cough of a noise and a sharp sting in my side. I later found it was a guy who was killed by having his head blown off by a shotgun, and the killer was on my tracks as I ran, with the sting turning out to be a shotgun pellet. The guy was caught, thankfully. It is still frightening to imagine what could have been if I ran a little later. We had a corpse turn up in the woods behind my house. There was an older gentleman that would always chop firewood from tree falls out there. One day he was hiking around, saw what he thought was a weird rock, turned it over, and it was a human skull. My house was right on the only access road, so when I came home from school, there must have been like 60 cars out there. All LEOs and paramedics, crime scene unit, etc. Some guy who had schizophrenia went out into the woods. It was an older gentleman that had gone missing a few years prior. They think he died of exposure, and coyotes had gotten at the body because he was scattered around. I came across the scene of a motor vehicle accident right after it happened. It was a single SUV that hit a notorious curve going much too fast and rolled several times. The car was full of teenagers coming back from a day of partying on the river, and none of them were wearing seatbelts. 15-year-old kid was face down on the pavement, obviously very dead, having just been ejected. His name was Anthony, and he went to school with my little brother. You better believe that I'm aggressive as F about seatbelt usage nowadays. That image will never leave me. Later in life, I came across a dead guy at a Seattle bus stop. Disturbing, but didn't stay with me the way that Anthony did. Hey folks, I know seatbelts might feel like a minor inconvenience, but if you weigh the joy of not wearing one versus the potential of dying or at least getting severely injured, maybe wear your seatbelt. In a retirement home, I walked into a room to an old man lying on the couch. I thought the old man was sleeping, so I shut the door. 2 hours later, we saw paramedics walk into his room. A guy at my university was walking to class with his earbuds in and his hood over his head. He walked right across train tracks, lost in thought, while other people were screaming at him that the train was coming. I was about 2 minutes behind and saw the immediate results of this guy not paying attention. It's a weird feeling, the matter-of-fact nature of seeing a dead person. It's not like anything else changes. The train stopped, the people who saw it were horrified, and the police came. But before the end of the week, no one at the school was even talking about it. In my second year at university, my good friend at the time went missing for 2 days, and after getting the warden to come with me and check his room, we found him dead. He had committed self-termination in the 2 days I hadn't seen him. What still haunts me is that my last message to him was, "Hey man, you still alive?" in a joking way. Safe to say I've never sent anyone a message like that again. Please leave your story in the comments. I would love to make a video on them in the future. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe.